All around the centre of northern towns, hundreds of northern towns, beyond the town hall and the shopping malls, there's another world, a largely Victorian world of back lanes and terrace streets, of factories and mills, corner shops, chip shops and pubs, which some people point to as evidence that it's grim up north. That's the world that I'm going to explore in this programme. It's a world that I know very well because I have never lived in anything but a terraced house. In fact, I've lived in my present terraced house for 36 years, which some people think is a trifle unadventurous. So, for this programme, I'm going to spend the day in this grim netherworld of back streets, and that means going to work. But first of all, I need to pop into the corner shop to buy a few pies for me bait. Ever since working-class terrace streets like this one first appeared in the middle of the 19th century, there have been corner shops. It was always part of the bylaws that controlled the builders, that they had to keep the shops and the houses as separate as possible, so they tended to stick them onto the end of the terraces, where they were more noticeable, of course, which was good for business, and anyway, the developers could charge a bit more for the corner sites if they put shops onto them. Aha, growlers, one for later and one for now. So, off to the mill. This is Dicksons Mill in Carlisle, which I'm showing you because it's a great mill, as you can see, but also because it was the scene of my first job in me school halls in 1964. It was built in 1836 as a cotton mill, and for a very few brief years it was the largest factory in the world, one of Carlisle's few claims to fame. You would know that this was a textile mill instantly, wouldn't you? Because it looks like one. Tall, multi-storey, rather narrow, with big windows to provide as much natural light as possible. Before gas lighting arrived, factories were always quite narrow, so that each workroom had rows of windows along both sides. And even later on, a lot of mills continued to be built narrow because natural light was cheaper than artificial light. As well as the main building, there was of course always a big chimney to make the steam engine as efficient as possible. Oh, I love chimneys, and so few of them survive by comparison to the past. I know they've got no purpose anymore, and you can understand them going, but they are fantastic icons of what we once were. I've always loved this building. When I was growing up, I thought it stood alongside Carlisle Castle and the cathedral as one of the three main buildings in the town, and I still do. It's not exactly great architecture, but it's undeniably impressive. I don't need to tell you that mills like Dicksons Mill are to be found all over the north, in Lancashire and the West Riding, both sides of the Pennines, stretched out in long rows along the riverbanks, mill after mill, forming formidable cliffs of stone. In town after town, you find them dominating the valley bottoms and leaving the steep hillsides for people to live on. Pretty well everywhere you go, you find that everything was built in the same style, a simple, stripped-down, classical style with hardly any fancy bits at all. Queen Street Mill in Burnley, though, is a different shape, another typical mill shape. Instead of towering upwards, it's low and vast, and instead of having rows of windows along the side, it lets in natural light through the roof, north-facing windows to keep the glare out and the light as even as possible. It's a cotton mill, which was opened in 1895. Amazingly, it was owned from the start by a workers' cooperative, with each of the worker owners putting in a fiver towards the £20,000 that it cost. Sadly, they don't own it any longer because it's a museum now, but it's still got all of its original bits and pieces and all still in working order. And it just happens to be the last surviving steam-driven mill in the world. Now, isn't that something? I bet you would love to see its steam engine. Now, if this programme was being introduced by Fred Dibner or someone like that, you would be hearing all about governors and pistons and valves and crankshafts. But I'm afraid I don't know very much about engines. It does say in my little leaflet that it generates 500 horsepower, which sounds like an awful lot of horses, but may not be, if only I knew. I like this one though. I like the room that it's in, these solidly workmanlike old-fashioned green tiles. And the engine. I really like the way that it looks and gleams, and the way that it smells too, though obviously you'll have to take my word for that. I like the way it's called peace, even though it's not peaceful at all. What a wonderful survival. What a marvellous object. What Peace drove was looms for weaving cotton. Aren't they interesting? I bet you'd like to see them working. As I've already said, it was a cotton mill, a cotton weaving mill, and it made plain cotton cloth, ready for bleaching and printing with patterns and things like that. And it made the cloth on over 1,000 Lancashire looms, and there are still more than 300 of them in here, all original and all still as noisy as ever. Isn't this an extraordinary room? The scale of it is just breathtaking. You see what I was saying about the windows, none at all in the walls, and all of the daylight provided by the zigzag windows in the roof. What a great bit of industrial design it all is. Sturdy iron columns, massive iron beams, or are they steel? They could be either by 1894. And then the machinery. You'd have to be dead not to be fascinated by the looms and the way the piece's power is transmitted to all of them. In 1964, when I was 17 and working through my summer holidays at Dicksons Mill, machines like these were all still running. They weren't looms actually, they were spinning yarn, and they'd moved over from cotton to wool, but the effect was the same. Thousands of mills, thousands and thousands of machines, and tens of thousands of mill girls, chattering their way down the terraced streets every morning and shrieking their way through the working day. And now they're all gone. Where are they now? Faded away, memories and museum pieces. Hey, I've got myself all upset thinking about the good old days, if that's what they were. I think I need to go and cheer myself up with a swift pint on the way home. I love pubs, I really do, and so of course did the residents of our back streets. The 19th century, the period when our great northern working class back streets were taking shape, was a period of great change and warfare even in the world of the pub. It was a battle of the brewers. Until the middle of the 19th century, most pubs were small. You still see them everywhere with ordinary housey windows upstairs, frosted or chased glass windows downstairs. Often there's a corner door. But as the century progressed, they tended to get posher, gleamier, with tiles and other decorative features to tempt the passer-by. But by the second half of the 19th century, when the mills and the factories were going full tilt and wages were pretty high in the north, there was a terrific explosion of new pubs as the big breweries battled with each other for the loyalty and the lolly of the working man. I've got a book here by a neighbour of mine called Lynn Pearson, which is about the pubs of the North East. And in it she says that in 1882 there were 883 places in Newcastle where you could buy alcohol, which seems like a lot. She also says that average consumption of beer was 5 pints a week for every man, woman and child. Now, working on the assumption that many children didn't take up their full statistical allowance, that means that an awful lot of chaps were drinking an awful lot of beer, and the breweries started a battle to make sure that they drank it in their pubs. As part of their campaign to attract the drinking man, the breweries built drinking palaces. You see them everywhere, and however much they've been altered inside to take account of changing tastes, from the outside they're still obviously palaces. This one's called the Dun Cow, and it's in Sunderland. It was built in 1902 for a local brewery called Dukas by an architect called B.F. Simpson, and it towers like an ornate palace, which of course was a very deliberate impression because its size and its architectural splendour was an advertising ploy to pull in the punters. It's got a big corner tower to act as a sort of beacon, and the facade is enriched with marble, and there are big glowing windows to make it look fab at night. Who could resist it? Well, not me, evidently, because suddenly there I was, inside. Oh. What the late Victorian drinker found when he went into almost any of these massive pubs was, well, still a palace, a jewelled and finely wrought, a delicately made palace. You might have expected them to be tawdry and brash, but the surviving examples suggest not. I think this bar in the Dun Cow is just a beautiful room. The counter itself is original, and so is the back bar, the shelves on the wall behind the bar, which is just delicious. A delicate filigree of mahogany fretwork. The shapes are sinuous and halfway between Gothic and Art Nouveau, and the same shapes are picked up in the curved glass screen which divides the room in two. The most remarkable thing about these gigantic and exquisitely decorated turn-of-the-century pubs is that they were palaces specifically built for the working man. They were avoided by the middle classes. The 1901 edition of the International Travel Guide Baedeker's advised tourists not to come into taverns or public houses because they were for working men. They were fantasies to tempt ordinary men away from home to experience luxuries that they couldn't get anywhere else at all. They were dream factories. And what I'm dreaming of now is a nice bag of chips. And since I'm feeling pretty self-indulgent, possibly a little bit of battered cod on my way home. Nobody really knows for sure who first brought fried fish and chips together as an item, but one of the claimants is a shop opened by a man called John Lees in 1863 in Mossley near Manchester. It's set up originally in a hut to sell pea soup and pig's trotters. A rare delicacy, I'm sure, and perhaps not rare enough. But fortunately he gave that up at some time in the 1860s to sell fish and chips instead. Some people think it was another Lancashire shop, a man called Dyson from Oldham, who was a tripe dresser. That's his job, incidentally, not a comment on his dress sense. But he's believed to have ordered a range specifically for fish and chips in 1866. But wherever it started, the fish and chip trade grew fastest in the fertile ground of northern working towns, especially the mill towns of the Pennines, where there was a large working population which was rich enough to buy a few treats, and where there were a lot of women working in the mills with too little time to cook. The Pennine towns were also close to two seas, and by the 1860s they were well served with railways, so that there was always a plentiful supply of fresh fish. And anyway, fish and chip shops look best in the back streets of northern towns. That's where they're meant to be. I'm not suggesting that they're architecture, of course. They've hardly ever got any special design qualities, but that doesn't mean that they're not worth looking at. They're an important part of the northern townscape. At night they gleam irresistibly in the darkness of terraced streets. And even if they're not architecture, they do have a style and a warmth of their own, especially on cold winter nights. Lovely places.
One salt and vinegar. Yes, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, that's the end of my nostalgic day in the world of the back streets. Time to pop off home now to my little terraced house and possibly a quick bath before bed. Oh, what a ghastly sight I hear you cry. Will this man stop at nothing to shock us? No. Do you know, I don't think I've ever had a bath in front of the fire before, though I do remember hearing a story from an elderly miner in Blythe who said that when he went to see his girlfriend, she was obviously getting ready to have a bath in front of the fire, and he got up to leave, but her father said, "Never hesh yourself, son, she won't splash you." I don't know what happened next. I don't suppose he saw out, but then neither will you. Nobody has tin baths in front of the fire anymore, and of course this rather cosy world of the back street doesn't exist either, not in the same way that it once did. This, for example, is not a little museum piece but my back room, awash with modern stuff, with CDs and electric lights, comfy sofas and books. This Edwardian terraced house, like millions of others around our northern towns, has proved to be continuously adaptable. I've got a report. It's an English Heritage Report, which was published in 2005, which maintains that repairing a standard Victorian house over 30 years is up to 60% cheaper than building and maintaining a new house. We still love our terraced houses because they're still good to live in. They're well built, solid materials. They're kept warm by their neighbours, but the walls are thick enough to keep next door's noises out. Their backyards offer privacy, but their design encourages neighbourliness. I know, this is a rosy picture, probably too rosy, but it's been my experience, and you know, these houses are one of the triumphs of the Victorian period. Until the Victorians started to invent streets like this, ordinary people in the north lived in disgusting conditions. Just bear with me while I read a bit of a description of poor people's houses in Manchester in 1844. The writer describes how they lived in courts which could only be reached through covered passageways from the street. And he goes on to describe filth and disgusting grime, and he says that they were the most horrible houses he has yet beheld. And then he writes, "In one of these courts there stands directly at the entrance at the end of the covered passage a privy without a door, so dirty that the inhabitants can pass into and out of the court only by passing through foul pools of stagnant urine and excrement." A pretty picture. Well, that was the world that our Victorian forefathers turned into the back streets which we still cling to today. And how we cling to them, even the factories. You would have thought, well, I would have thought, that we'd have been glad to get rid of them when they were no longer used, symbols of drudgery and oppression, but that hasn't happened. All over the north we've shown astonishing versatility in finding new uses for them. We live in them, we turn them into museums and retail outlets, art studios and offices, anything rather than pull them down. We still love this backstreet world. It's still entirely part of our identity, what makes us northern, what makes us British. It's not stood still, of course. The pub that I was in before isn't some frozen museum. It's been adapted continuously to satisfy changing tastes and new technologies. best of the old, mingled in with plenty of new. The traditional chippy has been joined by scores of alternatives that reflect the marvellous range of cultures that make up Britain today. So that prawn biryani or pizza marinara are just as common as deep-fried cod. And it just leaves you with some very difficult choices to make when planning your tea. Chicken jalfrezi, pizza, cod bites, kebabs, beef chow mein,